Okay, guys, so I decided that I was going to record a very short video. I know we've been going over all of these elements for the first half of the semester, but now I kind of want to condense it and refresh and kind of pull out the most important things as we go into the second half of the semester and actually start writing short stories. So, what exactly is a short story? When we think about writing fiction, often we think about novels. A short story is not just shorter. Obviously, that's the most obvious thing. The general limit is between 1,000 and 7,500 words. Now, this really will vary depending on if you're going to submit it somewhere. They may have different parameters. Anything under 1,000 is usually considered flash fiction. Anything over 7,500 to 30,000 is a novella, and then anything over that is a novel. These are very loose rules. I've seen some places that ask for submissions that would not allow over 3,000 words for a short story. And then there are some that have no limits. So it really just depends. But this is a good general idea of what a short story should be. However, when we think about a shorter story, it becomes important. It's not just a novel cut off at the knees or a chapter or segment of a longer story. It should be a full, complete story that has a beginning, a conflict, an ending that's satisfying, and that has everything that is needed in order for the reader to feel like they've actually read a story. What this means is that you have fewer words to tell your story. It's not that you're going to cut it short. It means that your words have to have much greater impact. You have to choose your words correctly. You don't have room for long exposition, meaning you can't tell a backstory on this character or about this setting or explain the world in great detail. You have to find a way to integrate those important elements into the writing itself, into the story as it goes. So, for example, instead of saying something to the effect of, in this world, people can talk to animals, and this is how this came about through a laboratory experiment. You're not going to go into all that detail. You may just have it start with a person having a conversation with their dog, and through the uh, the the steps of the story, perhaps it will come out that this is how some kind of laboratory experiment allowed people to be able to talk to their dogs. It makes it much easier for the reader to not have a lot of exposition, and you just don't have room for it. Um, you want to get right to the action of the story, introduce the main characters, introduce the conflict. When I was going through my undergrad and my grad program, focusing on writing and short stories, start as close to the ending as possible is pretty much hammered into my head because I wanted to tell these really long stories that rambled until I got to the point. So I've learned think about my end point and how close can I start my story to that end point and have it make sense. And a lot of this goes into showing, don't telling. And I'm going to go into more detail in another lecture about what that means. But you really want the action to tell the story, not you as a narrator or as the writer trying to explain it to the reader. How does this affect the writing itself? One, you're not going to have a cast of thousands. You're going to have one main character and as few supporting characters as possible. When you have a very short story and you try to cram a lot of people in there, the main character gets lost and it all gets muddied. The same thing with setting. You're not going to have your characters going to 100 different places. One or two, maybe three settings is probably enough. You want the story to come forward, not you having to continue to explain or describe a new setting every couple of paragraphs. Your plot should be simple. That doesn't mean that it's simplistic, but you don't have room for anything complicated. You can't have subplots. If your character is trying to save the world, you don't have time for him to also have a romantic entanglement on the side. That will work for a novel, and he may have a romantic interest, but it can't take up a lot of room. And your conflict also should be simple and easily understood. And sometimes you don't really understand, where it might be going or what your conflict is. This is why we edit. This is why we go back. This is why we tweak things. We ask questions. We ask for feedback. It's not an easy thing to do, to write a short story. It can be fast and it should be fun, but it's not necessarily easier than writing a novel because you're actually having to compact a lot of ideas into a short amount of time. And then you should have a resolution. You can't just, like I said before, it's not a novel cut off at the knees. It should be a full story that ends at a logical place. Doesn't mean a happy ending. It may leave the reader thinking or questioning or having more, thoughts afterwards, wondering what happened, but it should resolve the main conflict one way or the other. So, one of the hardest things for anyone, especially if you're not someone who's had a lot of experience or interest in writing, is getting started. So, you start with an idea, but it does not have to be perfect. You may not know where it's going to go, but you just have to start somewhere. And you don't want to be afraid of going out of your comfort zone. Maybe you're not a writer. Maybe you have no idea how to even take characters and have them have a conversation. Practice. The only way to get better at something is to practice. And you can't practice unless you actually sit down and do it. Even if you have to go back and hit the backspace button and start all over, that is still practice and a good exercise. And you can always edit what doesn't work. And one thing, going back to the length, maybe you will write a short story and get carried away and you realize, oh my gosh, this is, 20,000 words. That's fine. You can go back and edit that. You can take out the things that maybe aren't as pertinent, but while you were writing, you needed to get that down on paper so you understood where the story was going. One of my professors called this writing yourself into the story. You overwrite and then you go back and edit, but you can't edit anything that you don't have. So don't be afraid to just go wild, write the craziest story you can think of, and go back and say, okay, this doesn't work. Even if you scrap it and start over, it's still practice and it's a good exercise. Where do we find ideas? They're everywhere. They can be anything because a story is just at the heart of it. It's just people like you and me going through something. There's a really interesting story called Hills Like White Elephants by Ernest Hemingway. And it's basically just a couple sitting outside waiting for a train having a conversation. And it takes a while to kind of figure out what they're talking about. But you can just imagine someone sitting to the side hearing this conversation, wondering, okay, are they arguing? Are they together? I don't know if this is how he came up with this story, but it's a really good observation of basically, a human interaction. And it's a very famous story. If you have a chance to look it up, it's very short. Social justice issues. If you've been in my dystopian class, we read The Ones Who Walked Away from Omelas. If you haven't read that story, it's about a supposedly utopian um, city that only finds its utopia out of torturing one small child, kind of like a sacrifice for their utopian world. And obviously, it's a metaphor for something a lot bigger, but you can imagine Ursula Le Guin, who wrote a lot of these types of stories, starting with the idea of what kind of world would sacrifice one segment of society for the greater good of the other, and then kind of going from there. Um, Edgar Allan Poe, one of my favorite writers and poets, pretty much his stories are a little dark. You can find, if you like dark stuff, you can find fodder for dark stuff anywhere on the news, Netflix, social media. There's all kinds of nuggets of ideas out there. And it can be based on true stories. Even though it's fictional, you can find those ideas out of actual things that have happened in our time. So, just to sum up, this is your creation. It doesn't have to follow all these rules exactly. It can be a little bit longer, a little bit shorter. Maybe you are going to have a whole bunch of characters in there and you can make it work. If you can make it work, awesome. Um, does there have to be a theme or an underlying message? A lot of times, short stories are kind of trotted out as, a mirror for our society, and that's great. If you don't have a particular theme or underlying message, don't worry about it. If you just want to write a story that's fun, do it because it should be fun. And if it's not working, don't be afraid to scrap it and go back. I have an entire folder full of short stories that have never seen the light of day, but they got me to the point where I was able to write short stories that were eventually published. So don't ever think that what you're doing is not worth it. If you're interested in writing beyond this class, anything that you do is going to help you get to that goal.